Morrison Gulch has been one of the most closely documented fish passage improvement projects in Humboldt County. Many failed leap attempts were observed and recorded at this site, but it was also a site where significant permitting hurdles were encountered and where new design guidelines were developed and tested for the first time. Observations to document migration attempts began in November of 1998. The culvert was quickly recognized as a complete migration barrier to all species and life stages of salmonids due to the extremely perched outlet. The leap height at this site ranged from 4 to 5 feet, depending on flow conditions in the creek, and leaping conditions were not ideal due to the large rock face below the outlet. On January 15, 1999, over 400 failed leap attempts were observed in a 3-hour period. No successful leaps were ever observed, and spawner surveys confirmed that no adult coho spawned upstream of Quarry Road. Due to permitting delays, the county was unable to replace the culvert during the 1999 construction season. It looked as if Morrison Gulch would be inaccessible for yet another season. But as an interim solution, NOAA Fisheries granted Ross Taylor permission to capture and relocate salmon upstream of Quarry Road. When the fish started leaping again, Ross, assisted by other culvert observers, were ready for them. During a 4-day period, 6 female and 8 male coho salmon were netted while leaping at the outlet. These fish were carried across the road and released in the upstream channel.
1 second. Okay, everything
Bye-bye, fish.
Spawner surveys confirmed that the fish successfully spawned in Morrison Gulch, with one pair observed nearly 2,100 feet upstream of Quarry Road. A snorkel survey conducted in August of 2000 confirmed that coho fry were rearing in Morrison Gulch upstream of the culvert. The 4-foot diameter culvert was replaced in August of 2001 using a hydraulic design option. A 9-foot diameter culvert was chosen in part due to the new requirements to pass the 100-year flood. But first, 6 boulder grade control weirs were constructed, 3 on the downstream side of the crossing to backwater the culvert outlet, and 3 on the upstream side of the crossing to minimize downcutting in the channel. On the first storm of the fall, the weirs were effectively backwatering the culvert and creating favorable passage conditions. On December 11, 2001, the first group of adult coho salmon were observed migrating freely through the culvert and spawning in Morrison Gulch. During the first winter after treating the barrier, 80 adult coho salmon and 39 reds were documented in Morrison Gulch. Over the 4 winter seasons since the barrier was removed, an average of 109 adult coho and 61 reds have been observed in Morrison Gulch. The peak year so far was the second year following treatment, when 238 salmon and 116 reds were recorded. Reds and live fish have been observed nearly 3,100 feet upstream of Quarry Road in the main stem of Morrison Gulch, and 300 feet up a small tributary to Morrison Gulch. The upper limit of anadromy is most likely a waterfall located approximately 3,600 feet upstream of Quarry Road. There are many challenging obstacles to migration throughout the channel in the form of woody debris jams, but the fish manage to get under or over these as stream flows rise and fall. Each spring and summer since the crossing was treated, Morrison Gulch appears well seeded with young-of-the-year coho salmon fry. Many fry also appear to be leaving Morrison Gulch to rear in the main stem Jacoby Creek. 4 years have passed since the replacement of the old culvert, and now the progeny of the first spawners are starting to return on their own. In November of 1998, a large storm washed out a private culvert upstream of Murray Road, which plugged the county culvert and caused the stream flow to be diverted down the road. The county roads crew deliberately cut a notch through the road prism to keep Lindsay Creek in its channel. As a temporary measure, the county installed an overflow pipe next to the culvert and repaired the road base. However, the inlet was damaged, and the county realized it was vital to replace this culvert for both traffic safety and fish passage issues. The damaged culvert was replaced with a 20-foot wide open bottom arch set on concrete footings during September and October of 2001. This crossing now provides unimpeded passage for all species and life stages of salmonids, as well as passing the 100-year flood. In addition to improved fish passage, this crossing is also used by deer, bears, raccoon, and other terrestrial wildlife. County road crews have already noted a drop in the frequency of road kills since the open bottom arch was installed. After freely migrating through the Murray Road culvert, adult salmon find migration conditions have improved at a number of upstream private crossings as well. Prior to the 1998 storm, the first crossing on Railroad Grade was a severe barrier that prevented most fish from moving upstream. After the culverts failed during the 1998 storm, the landowner installed a bridge at this crossing. Crockett Crossing is the next private crossing upstream. Here again, a bridge was installed by the property owners after many years of struggling with the failure-prone, undersized culvert. In December of 2004, both Chinook and Coho utilized the upstream channel. Upstream of the Crockett Crossing, a similar scenario unfolded at Burnt Stump Lane. Property owners combined resources to replace a pair of undersized culverts with a small bridge, and the results were impressive. The Coho Run in Upper Lindsay Creek peaked approximately 3 weeks after the peak of the Chinook salmon spawning. In December of 2004, many Chinook salmon spawned in Lindsay Creek. Along some reaches, there were multiple redds excavated on every pool tail and suitable riffle. Many salmon, including this large male Chinook, lingered on for days after the peak spawning had occurred. Female salmon often stay in the vicinity of their completed redds to prevent other spawning fish from digging up her redd and damaging the eggs. Lindsay Creek now has unlimited access to salmon and steelhead all the way to the natural limit of anadrony. The Mather Creek culvert under Murray Road was assessed as a complete barrier to juvenile salmonids and a partial barrier to adults. The outlet was armored with riprap, which formed a steep drop that impeded migration. The culvert was also in poor condition and severely undersized for storm flow conveyance. The original 6-foot diameter culvert was replaced in 2002 with a 16-foot diameter structural steel plate culvert embedded 2.5 feet below the channel. Once set below stream grade, the culvert was backfilled with a mix of cobbles, gravels, and sand. The project was completed in early November, prior to the onset of the first winter rains. After several high flow events, the substrate placed in the culvert was still in place, and the culvert appeared to be providing unimpeded passage. In fact, coho seem to prefer holding and spawning within the culvert rather than in the natural channel. This is likely due to the lack of suitable spawning gravels upstream of the culvert, where the parent geology is made up of old sand dune deposits. Spawner surveys over the past 2 winters documented that the majority of spawning has occurred inside or just upstream of the culvert in the gravels and cobbles used as backfill. The Mather Creek crossing mimics passage conditions within the natural channel. Inside the culvert, the stream flow has carved meanders and created riffles similar to those within the natural channel. Long-term maintenance of this spawning area may require input of additional substrate as the fish and stream flow move the gravels downstream. Options to create spawning riffles on private property upstream of the crossing are currently being explored. Sullivan Gulch was one of the first closely observed culverts in Northern California. This site had long been recognized as a partial barrier to salmon migration due to the perched outlet and high velocities through the culvert. Several retrofits were attempted in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Boulder weirs were built to reduce the entry leap, and baffles were placed within the culvert to slow the flow. One of our first observations was the large number of failed leap attempts by juvenile salmon and steelhead at the culvert outlet. Most of these attempts were observed prior to and during the migration of adult salmon. At first this was confusing until we learned that juvenile coho salmon and steelhead follow spawning adults into tributaries to gorge on eggs broadcast during the spawning process. Salmon eggs provide a rich source of nutrients at a time when other food sources are limited. Hundreds of juvenile leap attempts per hour were documented, but very few successes. After the first rains brought up the flow in Sullivan Gulch, the migration of adult salmon would start. The frequency of adult attempts usually increased after the peak of the storm flow. Most of the attempts were failures, but some fish succeeded in entering the culvert. Many failed attempts occurred when fish leapt into the outlet beam, a structure installed to improve the hydraulic conditions near the culvert outlet. But now it seemed to be blocking fish from getting into the culvert. At higher flows, fewer leaps were observed, especially as storm flows were increasing. At peak flows, no fish were observed leaping, but it wasn't long until they started again. As flows decreased, the fish would resume their migration, and some succeeded in entering the culvert. Those fish that successfully negotiated the culvert still faced a series of obstacles to navigate, starting with the oversteepened, shallow riffle on the upstream side of the culvert. Gravel and cobbles typically drop out above the inlet, leaving behind a long riffle or steep drop just upstream of the culvert. These riffles can be barriers that prevent upstream migration, especially during long periods of low flow. We sometimes observed salmon turning around and heading back down below the culvert, rather than trying to get up over this riffle. Spawning typically occurs over several days, where the female excavates her nest, also known as a redd. In many cases, more than one male will fertilize a single female's eggs. The female will hold on her redd until she dies, guarding it from juveniles and other females looking to dig a redd. Coho and Chinook salmon die shortly after spawning, and their carcasses provide important nutrients to the whole riparian system. While the adults are spawning, the juveniles still try to move upstream, but are blocked by the culvert's perched outlet. The culvert at Sullivan Gulch was replaced in 2001. A 16-foot wide open-bottom arch set on concrete footings was constructed using a stream simulation design. This type of design creates passage conditions through the crossing similar to those found in the natural channel. Besides unimpeded passage of adult and juvenile salmon, the properly sized culvert also allows for the free flow of water, bedload, and large wood during peak storm events. High flow conditions through the new crossing show a lack of backwatering that is apparent when compared to the flood flows through the old culvert. While there is no longer a pool downstream of the culvert outlet, both salmon and steelhead use this area for spawning. And the culvert itself provides good cover for adults to evade predators. Biologists conduct spawner surveys after winter storms to determine the number of returning adults and the number of redds constructed.